The floor will be given to Professor Gianmarco Ottaviano.
Okay, so thank you for being here. It's really an honor, and it's an honor also because I see some of my former professors in the room, some of my current colleagues, and some of my current students. So it's really an important moment for me. So I'm going to talk about economic geography of European nationalism, and I will try to cover at least a century or so, because things that we're living today, because we are now around, they look new to us, but a lot of things have already happened in the past. As a prologue, I would like to start with the role of elites in driving Europe and in driving some important events. So this is just an example. These are the Chamberlains, and this is a family that for more than 60 years has been central in the UK and the history of the UK. I will start, the old guy is George Chamberlain, who was a nationalist, since we are talking about that, and an imperialist when we were at the high times of the British Empire. His son, the other two are his sons. So you can read this quote about globalization. We are in the period of the first wave of globalization, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And you could take this quote and apply it today exactly the same. So I think we all agree that we are living in the most interesting times, and times in which a lot of things are happening. There are a lot of new things we can do, so new objects of interest, but also a lot of new objects of anxiety. That was really the period of the classical nationalism. And then there was something else that happened, and everything was shut down by the First World War. After the First World War, his son came to prominence as a minister again in the UK, Austen Chamberlain, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1925 because he was behind the negotiations that led to the Locarno's treaties that are the treaties that thought they solved all the divisions of borders after the First World War. So that was a period in which the big Austrian-Hungarian Empire, among others, disappeared. New national states were created. It was a period in which the different countries entered in a lot of quarrels about the new borders, and our country too, if we think about the eastern border, precisely where these new national states were born. And in 1925, Chamberlain was awarded the Nobel Prize because they thought that the agreements that they'd reached would have solved all the problems of borders in Europe. The problem was that the agreement was, the treaty was pretty precise about the borders on the western side of Europe, but left some things open on the eastern side. And the result was what came later. An interesting quote from Austen Chamberlain is this quote that is talking about something that is called the Chinese curse, even though it has nothing to do with China, despite what he's mentioning. And it is something that is now in the common language in the UK, which is, may you live in interesting times, which is not considered as something positive. Interesting times are times in which you have one crisis after the other, one shock after the other, and there is no substantial peace. And indeed, these were interesting times. We are in the end of the 30s. And in the end of the 30s, the prime minister was his half-brother, Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain is probably the most well-known of the Chamberlains because he was the prime minister of the UK that according to at least a large part of the historians, didn't realize how important was the threat coming from these people. And he signed another agreement, the Munich Agreement. It was essentially a way to trying to curtail, from a diplomatic point of view, the aggressivity aggressiveness of Germany, but eventually it didn't work, as we all know. And indeed, when Hitler, despite this Munich agreement, started to invade several parts of Eastern Europe, and we are back to why the Locarno treaties didn't work, Chamberlain was forced to step down. And he stepped down it's quite interesting as a coincidence with our talk, because he stepped down after the Allied forces were forced to leave Norway. And so we will hear more about Norway in a bit. That's the background, and as you see, when we look at these quotes, there are a lot of things that sound a bit familiar to us, but not that tragic, we all hope. At the moment, what we are facing is something extraordinary in terms of European Parliament elections. So far, European Parliament elections were not really stimulating any particular sentiment across Europe. But now we feel there is something important there. And indeed, in a recent article, The Economist claims that the next European Parliament elections will be the most European yet, meaning that at least people know what we are voting for. If you think about the referendum on Brexit in the UK, the day or just the hours after the outcome of the referendum, there was a peak of searches in the UK for the keywords European Union, meaning that people voted for something, some people voted for something that they didn't know. And indeed, this interdependence between the different parts of Europe has been highlighted in recent times by all sorts of what the previous quotes were calling crises and shocks. So there was the migration crisis in 2015, terrorist attacks that are still going on, Brexit, Trump, it is, and US new protectionism, and we are hearing about this today, too, again, the rise of China as a global competitor, and then all sorts of activities, so pro- and anti-immigration demonstrations. We see that in Italy and other countries, anti-establishment protests, and a growing sense that we should do something about the environment. Against these threats and crises, the importance of Europe has become, people are more and more feeling the appeal of a Europe that protects. And this Europeanization of the debate outside the border is particularly felt by nationalist and populist movements. But what is interesting is that while maybe last year we were still debating about leaving the European Union, nowadays nobody really is talking about that. What we are talking about is even on the nationalist side, is changing the European Union. And against these national movements, there is the polls are showing growing support for membership to the Union, and also we are seeing growing counter-mobilization of pro-European forces. So we're essentially in a moment in which everybody understands on one and the other side of the debate that we should not take the EU for granted anymore. What is behind these movements that are initially questioning the real existence of the European Union, and now they are thinking about how to change the European Union? To get an insight, it's useful to look at what has happened, for example, in the UK. So there, the vote for Brexit has been analyzed as a vote in the end of those who have not, so people that are at the bottom of the income distribution, against those that are at the top of the income distribution. And then there are all other sorts of explanation. But this resentment against urban elites is something that has played an important role there. So the idea that these amoral elites apply the rules of fair play only among themselves, they resist any sort of change in terms of participation to the elitarian choices, so this broken social elevator. They dodge taxation, looking for tax havens, and essentially they appropriate all the benefits of globalizations. And indeed, now we were talking about the Chinese curse before. There are studies in a lot of Western countries, starting from the US, but also in Europe, that are showing that if you want to have a single economic explanation of the rise of these sort of national movements, well, the best thing to do is to consider reaction against globalization. And in particular, as measured by the China shock, the penetration of the exposure of local economies to imports from China. And this protest vote essentially is concentrated in these areas where people simply feel that they are facing only the cost of globalization and not really all the gains. Now, this is a map, for example, taken from work by a colleague, a young colleague here two young colleagues actually here at Bocconi, Italo Colantone, sitting there, and Piero Stanik. They've tried this analysis for the UK, and this is the map of where the shock coming from the China competition has been concentrated. And if you superimpose this map with the map of the Brexit vote, you will see quite substantial overlap. So indeed, these changes due to globalization are really affecting the way people feel about voting. And you can look also at a broader picture about Europe, in which you are looking again at the China shock, so how the different, how competition from China and from emerging countries in general has affected the local economy, and you will find again a similar map. And this is, for example, again, another work by Italo and Piero. This is a map of the China shock in Europe. And if you look again at the distribution of votes, this for the parties that are nationalist or they are going for economic protectionism, what are sometimes called the radical right, then you see that there is something there here too. And if you look at Italy, you clearly see that the radical right and when this is darker, the China shock is more important. The north of Italy is the manufacturing base of the country, competition from China, mainly manufacturing. You see that you can predict actually fairly well the votes that we see nowadays. But it's not only about China. There is something that has been highlighted that is also about enlargement towards east of the European Union. That was a choice that was made, of course, to bring these countries within the democratic part of Europe. But at the same time, what happened is that creating a single market introduced not only competition from China, but also competition from European low-wage countries. And again, looking at these maps that we've seen before, you can actually trace the effect of now the east wind, the shock from the east, and you will have similar effects on voting patterns and discontent across Europe. So what is behind this phenomenon? There are two big secular trends that have been studied in parallel by different scholars, and here I'm citing two simply because they gave the names to these two trends. So the first is the Great Convergence, which is a term that is essentially the title of a book by Richard Baldwin a couple of years ago. And here what the Great Convergence is about is essentially the rise of emerging countries that are competing with the G7. On the other hand, there is a convergence which is global between countries that were less developed before and are converging towards the countries that are more developed. But there is also a local great divergence within countries. This is, again, something that has been called great divergence by Enrico Moretti, an Italian colleague in the US. And his study is on the US, but actually it looks pretty much the same in Europe, which is essentially arguing that due to skill-biased technological change, so change or new technologies that requires high skills rather than low skills, we are getting a polarization between an outward-looking, so open-minded and open to the rest of the world growth centers that are typically in cities, and instead stagnating backwaters that are rural in the US and in the periphery of Europe. This is, for example, these are graphs taken from Baldwin's works. On the left, you see the share of world manufacturing and how it evolved, especially since the 90s up to now. you see that the G7 share of world manufacturing has gone down from 65% to 47%. And where this has gone? Well, it's gone to emerging economies, and in particular here you see China from 3% to 19%. Now, manufacturing is only a part of the economy, but when you look at the entire weight of these countries in terms of GDP, you see something that is equally impressive. The share of G7 of the G7 in world GDP has gone down from 67% in '93 to 46% now. So this is the great convergence, the rise of emerging economies. The great divergence is, I mean, you can see that from this picture from space. These are nighttime lights. They are used nowadays to proxy for development around the world, economic development. Essentially, where you see lights, there is a lot of economic activities going on. And here, clearly, you see some big spots, and these are the big cities, and big dark areas, that is the rural America that votes for Trump. This is Europe, and this is in motion. Our space agency seems to put nicer pictures on the web than the US agency. So this is a European space agency. What you see is the evolution of these nighttime lights from '92 to 2010. And you see indeed that more lights are around, which means that indeed Europe, and especially look at the East, has been developing through the years. But you also see that places that had more light to start with, they become even brighter afterwards. So this is the big divergence. And without getting into the details, this is essentially a prediction that was simply a theoretical prediction because the data analysis at that time was not very sophisticated. Was a point raised by Paul Krugman to start with, that the project of integrating areas that, based on standard models at that time, economic models, would predict convergence across different places. If you introduce something that is more modern in terms of economies of scale and sorting of the most skilled workers in space, and complementarities, as we said, skill-biased technological change, would lead to cumulative causation and the emergence of growth centers and stagnant peripheries. And this is indeed something that was debated in the 90s without data, and we are starting to see, or at least according to Moretti, for example, we're actually seeing in the US nowadays, and explains this polarization of economic geography between places that are open and enjoy technological change and globalization, and places that instead they fall back. What has Europe to do with all this? So in particular, are we being driven by some technocrats and bureaucrats in Brussels in a direction that nobody wants? So this is something that is making the current parliamentary election quite interesting, because for once, at least more than in the past, you see in Europe participation on one side of the debate and on the other. And this is what Europe is about. So there are four misconceptions about Europe. That the first is that all the important decisions are made in Brussels and nobody at the national state is involved, so national government is not involved. People in Brussels are there without any democratic mandate. Indeed, even if they had a mandate, there is nothing that could be discussed properly at the European level because the national interests are those that matter. And the last is that the EU is luxury good nowadays that we cannot afford, and it's better to leave, and leaving will be giving us benefits. All four of these are quite misplaced. The first is the European Union a self-driving bureaucracy. Well, if citizens don't vote and don't care, clearly it is, but citizens have the possibility to participate twice. I mean, we're going to elect the European Parliament. We're going to elect, and regularly we elect our national parliaments, and the parliaments themselves, they express governments that are represented in the two councils that are the most important decision makers in Brussels. Second, is there any reason why something should be decided in Brussels? And the answer is yes, because there are some things that are called European public goods that cannot be provided by national states with coordination. And rather than defining what these goods are, but it's there in the slides, just read this list. And I think we all agree that these are things that require some kind of international coordination. Peace, freedom, security, social progress, environmental protection, technological progress, social, economic, territorial cohesion, respect of cultural and linguistic diversity, solidarity, social inclusion, no discrimination. So these are all things that are not efficiently provided as we see at the national level. The cost of non-Europe. So is it true that we can really leave the European Union and having benefits? This is really hard to find. I mean, economists have been looking at this in all sorts of different models, and this is something that it's hard to find. But one could say, well, but we are entering new territories, so maybe all your models and all your analyses that are based on data, one way or another, are not anymore that relevant. And the nationalists, what they have in mind is clearly not that they want to go to autarky and everybody in its own little garden, but they want to have some kind of independent national relation with the rest of the world, both commercially and politically. So what they have in mind is sort of EU light, in which countries are linked by mutual free trade agreements. They are also within Europe. Then they are free to sign agreements with whoever they want around the world, so there is no customs union. And then at the same time, this way they can really enjoy the benefits of economic sovereignty, controlling the flows of goods, services, capitals, and people, as well as, of course, the public budget. Now, the problem is this is not anything new. We had that before. This is where we are coming from. It was called the European Economic Community. That was a free trade agreement. And so we have colleagues, here is a research group in France, that have looked at the effects of going back to the European Economic Community. And what they find is that, well, this is going to cost substantially. Like a permanent crisis, economic crisis forever, 60.6% on average across member countries, slightly less among citizens simply because the losses will be concentrated in small eastern countries. And an important case study for this is indeed about Norway, because Norway is the country that has a very strict relation with Europe, with the European Union, but it is outside the European Union. And so I think this is really the time, also I see the time is running out, to stop and leave the floor to Karen Lennon to tell us about how life looks out when you are out of the European Union, but you cannot change your geography and move away.